In the high country of Bitterroot, survival isn't a hobby. It's a debt you pay to the mountain every single day. But to the new residents of the valley, people who built glass palaces with heated floors, William Wynne was nothing more than a ghost of a bygone era. A man who spent his summer digging a hole in the dirt while they enjoyed the alpine sun. They called it the tomb, a deep, reinforced underground bedroom that William, a retired combat engineer, was obsessed with perfecting. Every weekend, the sound of his industrial drill echoed through the pines, a rhythmic reminder of his supposed madness. Beside him always stood Smoky, a German shepherd whose eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare as his master. Neighbors would drive by in their luxury SUVs, windows rolled up against the dust, pointing at the veteran as he hauled lead line panels and oxygen tanks into the hillside. Planning for the end of the world, Will? They'd shout, their laughter echoing off the granite cliffs. William never answered. He only tightened the straps on his gear, his moss-green eyes scanning the horizon for a change in the wind that only a soldier could sense. He wasn't building a room to sleep in. He was forging a sanctuary, because he knew that nature doesn't care about your net worth when the mercury starts to scream. The weather reports called it a statistical anomaly, but to William, it felt like an incoming artillery barrage. Within 6 hours, the blue alpine sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. The temperature didn't just fall, it plummeted like a lead weight in the ocean. While the valley's smart homes tried to compensate, the sheer speed of the pressure drop caused glass to crack and pipes to seize instantly. This was the atmospheric bomb, a storm that happens once in a century. William stood on his porch, watching the first shards of ice rip through the air. He didn't wait for the official emergency broadcast. He whistled for Smoky, the sound sharp and urgent. They moved with the synchronized grace of a veteran unit. In the valley below, the lights of the mansions flickered and died as the main substation exploded under the strain of the ice. The laughter of the summer was gone, replaced by the terrifying sound of the wind screaming at 80 miles per hour. William stepped into his bunker, his moss-green eyes reflecting the last fading light of the world above. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the inner door. He knew the valley had just become a frozen grave, and his hidden bedroom was now the only living heart left in Bitterroot. Above ground, the world was being erased. The smart mansions, once the pride of the valley, had become elaborate ice boxes. Without power, the luxury glass walls that offered panoramic views were now thermal drains, sucking the heat out of every room. Families huddled together under expensive but useless duvets as the temperature inside dropped toward zero. Deep beneath the frost, William Wynne's hidden bedroom was a masterclass in survival engineering. The walls, insulated with aerogel and lead, held a steady, life-sustaining warmth. A small, silent diesel generator, vented through a concealed rock pipe, hummed like a distant heart. William sat on the edge of his bed, his moss-green eyes scanning a bank of battery-powered monitors. He could see the thermal signatures of the valley, or rather, the lack of them. The bright spots of human life were fading. Smoky paced the small room, his K9 senses picking up the frantic vibrations of the storm above. William knew that within 24 hours, the panic would set in. People would remember the man they laughed at. They would remember the crazy veteran who spent his summer digging a hole. And William, staring at the concrete ceiling, knew he had a choice to make. Stay in his sanctuary and survive alone, or open the door and invite the chaos of a dying valley into his last line of defense. The silence of the bunker was suddenly shattered, not by the storm, but by the frantic, distorted crackle of a handheld radio on the emergency frequency. Is anyone? Bitterroot Ridge, freezing, children. The voice was thin, brittle as the ice forming on the world above. William Wynne leaned over the console, his moss-green eyes narrowing. He recognized the voice. It was Miller, the developer who had led the chorus of laughter during the summer. Now, the man was begging. Above the bunker, the temperature had reached a lethal minus 50 degrees Celsius. In that kind of cold, the body stops fighting and starts to shut down. William looked at Smoky. The German shepherd's ears were pricked, his amber eyes fixed on a radio, as if he could smell the desperation. William knew the terrain. Miller's glass mansion was less than a mile away, but in this whiteout, it might as well be on the moon. Every tactical instinct told him to stay put, to protect the sanctuary. But the engineer in him, the soldier who had built bridges under fire, couldn't ignore a structural failure of human life. He began to don his specialized cold weather gear, a battery-heated tactical suit, a thermal mask, and a thick rope tether for Smoky. They weren't just leaving a room. They were exiting a fortress to enter a slaughterhouse of ice. As he checked the seal on his oxygen mask, William knew that the same people who mocked his hidden bedroom were now counting on it to be their only resurrection. When the outer door opened, the pressure differential nearly threw William backward. The wind didn't just blow. It roared like a jet engine, carrying shards of ice that could strip the paint off a tank. Instantly, his world became a 2-foot circle of white. He clipped Smoky's lead to his harness, a literal lifeline. Navigation was impossible by sight. So William relied on the inertial navigation system he'd spent the summer mapping into his tactical HUD. Every step was a fight against a wall of frozen air. He could feel the cold trying to find a gap in his suit, a relentless, searching enemy. Below him, the mansions were invisible, buried under drift that had reached 15 feet in hours. He was walking over the tops of luxury cars and garden fences. Smoky led the way, his nose low to the snow, sniffing for the faint scent of ozone and human habitation. They reached the Miller estate, but the palace of glass was gone. In its place was a jagged skeleton of steel and ice. The screams from the radio were replaced by a low, rhythmic thudding from inside the ruins. William smashed through a frozen patio door, his searchlight cutting through a darkness so thick it felt solid. Inside the smart home was a tomb of designer furniture and sub-zero despair. In the corner of what used to be $1 million wine cellar, William found them. Miller, his wife, and their 2 young children were huddled together under a pile of damp tapestries. Their breathing was shallow, the first sign that the cold was winning. Miller looked at William, but he didn't see the crazy veteran anymore. He saw a titan of iron and warmth. "Wynne, please," the man whispered, his pride long since frozen solid. William didn't waste time with words. He knew the physics of their situation. They had minutes before their hearts simply stopped. He began to distribute chemical heat packs from his rucksack, sticking them to the children's chests. He gave Miller a high-calorie survival bar, forcing him to chew. But the real challenge lay ahead, the trek back to bunker. Carrying 2 children through a centennial blizzard while tethered to 2 shivering adults was a feat that defied military logic. William looked at Smoky. The dog understood. He moved to the children, letting them huddle against his thick, insulated vest for a moment of shared heat. "We move now." William barked through his mask, his voice sounding like a god's command in the dark. "If you stop, you die. If you let go of the rope, you die. Follow the dog. 1 mile. In the city, it's a 10-minute stroll. In a centennial blizzard at negative 50 degrees. It is an odyssey through the heart of a frozen hell." William Wynne moved like a slow-motion juggernaut, his body acting as a windbreak for the Miller family. The wind was so violent it threatened to lift the children off their feet. But the orange lifeline held them together, a tether between the world of the living and the white void. Smoky was the true navigator, his paws finding the solid ground buried under 5 feet of shifting powder. Every few yards, Miller or his wife would collapse, their muscles seizing in extreme cold. William would roar at them through his mask, a sound more primal than the wind, forcing them back to their feet. "Don't look at the snow. Look at the dog," he commanded. His battery-heated suit was redlining, the power draining rapidly as it fought to keep his core temperature above the kill zone. He could feel his own eyelashes freezing into needles, and the child strapped to his chest was a dead weight of shivering fear. The hidden bedroom was no longer just a room. It was a lighthouse, and every step was a prayer that the diesel generator was still humming. Just as the darkness threatened to swallow them whole, Smoky let out a sharp, metallic bark. They weren't just close. They were standing on top of the sanctuary. The airlock slammed shut, cutting off the wind scream with a final, heavy thud. For a moment, there was only the sound of 5 people gasping for air in the dim, red light of the decontamination chamber. The cold followed them in, a ghostly mist clinging to their frozen clothes. William Wynne didn't wait. He moved with a brutal, life-saving efficiency, stripping the ice-cake parkas off the children and wrapping them in thermal mylar blankets. Miller sat on the concrete floor, his eyes hollow, watching the man he had once called a paranoid freak save his entire world. The temperature in the airlock was rising as the bunker's heat exchange system kicked in. Smoky shook himself, sending a shower of ice crystals flying against the concrete walls. William checked the inner door seals. They were safe for now, but as the heat returned to their bodies, so did the reality of their situation. The blizzard was just beginning, and they were now 5 people in a room designed for one soldier and his dog. William opened the inner door to the hidden bedroom. The warm glow of the lamps, the smell of dried wood, and the hum of the generator felt like heaven. But as Miller stepped inside, he looked at the lead-lined walls and the stacks of rations. He didn't laugh this time. He just fell to his knees and wept. 12 hours into the siege, the bunker was a bubble of life in a world of ice. William Wynne sat at his small desk, the rhythmic scratching of his pen on a logbook, the only sound beside the low hum of the air recyclers. Miller had finally stopped weeping and was now staring at the monitors. "The house. It's completely gone," he whispered, watching the thermal feed show nothing but a flat, white wasteland where his palace once stood. But William wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the sensors. The barometric pressure was dropping again. The second wave of the atmospheric bomb was hitting, and it was carrying something worse than wind, a deep freeze that would drop temperatures to minus 70 degrees. The bunker's external intake was beginning to freeze over. If the ice blocked the vents, they would suffocate in their own sanctuary. William looked at Smoky. The dog sensed a change, his tail low, pacing the narrow space between the bunk beds. William knew he had to go back out, not to save people this time, but to save the bunker itself. He had to clear the intake valve on the surface, or the hidden bedroom will become a very comfortable coffin for all of them. He grabbed a thermal lance and looked at the family. "Stay in the room. Do not touch the door. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, switch to the emergency oxygen tanks." The surface of the mountain was no longer earth. It was a screaming, horizontal ocean of ice. William Wynne crawled on all ho, his fingers numb despite the heated gloves, fighting against a wind that wanted to peel him off the ridge like a loose shingle. He reached the intake vent. a heavy steel pipe that was now a grotesque sculpture frozen. Condensation. The blockage was absolute. Inside the suit, William could hear his own labored breathing. A frantic rhythm that signaled the oxygen in the bunker was already thinning. He triggered the thermal lance. A blade of concentrated blue plasma cut through the darkness, hissing violently as it met the ice. Steam exploded into a blinding white shroud, instantly freezing back into crystals on his visor. It was a surgical battle in the heart of a chaos. Inch by inch, the blue flame ate through the obstruction. Just as the vent cleared, a massive gust slammed into William, throwing him 5 feet toward the edge of the ridge. He clawed at the frozen ground, his life hanging by the friction of his tactical boots. Then he felt it, a sharp, powerful tug on his belt. Smoky hadn't stayed inside. The dog had forced his way into the airlock and was now anchored to the hatch. His teeth clamped onto William's safety line. Together, the soldier and his dog fought the mountain for every inch of survival, proving that even in the dead of centennial winter, loyalty is the only heat that never fails. The air in the bedroom was sweet again, filtered and warm, but the mood was heavy with the silence of the dying world above. William Wynne sat on the floor, his back against the lead-lined wall, hand resting on Smoky's damp head. The Miller family had retreated to the bunk beds, the children finally asleep, their breathing rhythmic and calm. Miller approached William, his movements tentative, the arrogance of the developer replaced by the humility of a man who had lost everything but his pulse. "You knew," Miller whispered, gesturing to the concrete ceiling. "You saw this coming while we were complaining about the view." William looked up, his moss-green eyes reflecting a lifetime of observing the patterns of collapse. "Nature doesn't care about views, Miller. It only cares about thermodynamics." They sat in silence as the monitors showed the surface temperature hitting a record -75 degrees. The mansions were no longer homes. They were crystalline ruins. William began to check their supplies. They had food for weeks, but with 5 people, the CO2 scrubbers were working at triple their intended capacity. The hidden bedroom was holding, but the math of survival was getting tighter. He realized that the mockery of his neighbors wasn't the biggest threat. It was the ticking clock of their shared air in a world that had become a vacuum of ice. By the 3rd day, the atmospheric bomb had stabilized into a permanent, crushing cold. The radio remained a wall of static. The world outside Bitterroot had its own disasters to manage. Inside the bunker, the air was growing stale, tasting of ozone and recycled breath. William Wynne hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time. He moved through the small space with a quiet, mechanical precision, managing the fuel, the filters, and the fragile morale of the people he'd saved. Miller had become his reluctant apprentice, learning how to monitor the generator and hand crank the air back up if the diesel failed. "Why did you save us?" Miller asked one night, his voice hushed so as not to wake the children. William didn't look up from the engine he was servicing. "A soldier doesn't save people because they deserve it, Miller. He saves them because he can't live with the alternative." Smoky sat at the foot of the bed, a 30-kilogram shadow that never slept. He was the first to hear it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind, a deep, rhythmic thudding from the surface. It wasn't the storm. It was the sound of heavy-duty rotor blades cutting through the frozen air. The rescue wasn't coming for the mansions. It was coming for the only signal still broadcasting in the valley, William's bunker. The surface was a war zone of physics. The rotor wash from the heavy-lift Chinook was battling the 90-mile-per-hour winds, creating a cyclonic vortex of ice shards that threatened to shred anything flesh and blood. William Wynne stepped out, not as a victim, but as a landing officer. He held the high-intensity strobe light above his head, the rhythmic blue pulse cutting through the whiteout like a heartbeat. Smoky was anchored to his harness, his 30 kilograms frame low to the ice, acting as a living stabilizer. From the cockpit of the hovering giant, the pilots saw what they thought was impossible: a man standing firm on a ridge that should have been a graveyard. William didn't wave frantically. He moved with the surgical precision of a pathfinder, signaling the exact spot where the snow had been packed hard enough to take the weight of a winch line. The cold was biting into his bones, bypassing his heated suit as the battery finally gave up the ghost. His moss-green eyes were narrowed to slits, focused only on the mission. The winch cable descended, a steel umbilical cord lowering a rescue medic into frozen hell. As the medic hit the ground and saw the fortified hatch of the hidden bedroom, he realized that the only reason anyone in this valley was still breathing was the man and the dog who refused to yield to the mountain. The extraction was a blur of adrenaline and shivering terror. One by one, the Miller family was winched up into the belly of the Chinook. The children went first, wrapped in William's own spare wool blankets, followed by Mrs. Miller. Miller was the last of the civilians. As he was being hooked to the harness, he grabbed William's arm. "You're coming, right? There's room." William looked at his bunker, the stone and concrete sanctuary that had been his only project for 3 years. He looked at Smoky. He knew that the valley was still full of people who hadn't been as lucky as the Millers. He knew that someone needed to stay behind to maintain the radio beacon and guide other rescue. "Teams, go, Miller." William barked over the roar. "My mission isn't over." He unhooked his own line and stepped back. The medic tried to protest, but William's moss-green eyes held a look that brooked no argument, the look of a captain refusing to leave his post. The Chinook began to lift, its engine screaming as it clawed for altitude. From the window, Miller looked down and saw 2 small figures on the ridge, a man in a tactical parka and a German shepherd, standing motionless against the white void. The crazy veteran had given them his life, and now he was turning back to the shadows to find whoever else was left in the dark. The bunker was quiet once more, but it wasn't empty. The ghosts of the Miller family lingered in the scent of the blankets and the half-empty broth. "Bulls." William Wynne sat at the radio, his hand hovering over the dial. The hidden bedroom had proven its worth, but the valley was vast, and the atmospheric bomb was still dropping its icy payload. Suddenly, the static broke. It wasn't one voice this time. It was 3, 4, 5. The successful rescue of the Millers had acted as a catalyst. People across the ridge, inspired by the rumor of a survivor in the dirt, were finding the strength to reach for their radios one last time. "This is Bitterroot Lodge. We have 12 tourists. Heat is failing. This is the ranger station. 2 officers down." William listened, his moss-green eyes reflecting the data on his monitors. He was 1 man and 1 dog, but he held the keys to the only fortress in the valley. He realized that his summer of mockery was over, and his winter command had begun. He began to map the signals, triangulating their positions against the thermal maps of the bunker. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was the central hub for the Bitterroot relief effort. He looked at Smoky, who was already waiting by the airlock. "Rest up, boy," William whispered. "Tomorrow we go further." The hidden bedroom was no longer a sanctuary. It was a command post in a shadow war against nature. William Wynne, now fueled by coffee and a burning sense of duty, took charge. He reorganized the bunker's layout, turning the central supply area into a dedicated relief hub. He and Miller, who was proving surprisingly competent under William's strict tutelage, cataloged every item. They had rationed food for 5 people, but with 85 signals on the radio. The math was brutal. "We don't feed them, Miller," William said, his moss-green eyes as cold as the frost outside. "We provide heat and critical filtration. That's the priority." They began to prepare specialized heat packs using vacuum-sealed bags of raw salt, which, when combined with a specific chemical agent, could generate intense warmth for 8 hours without power. Smoky was a logistical link, trained to drag sleds of these packs through the drifts. The bunker hummed with a different kind of energy now, a collective will to fight back. As William plotted the first extraction, he looked at his hand, raw from the ice, resting on Smoky's K9 vest. He realized that the mockery was over. Now, they were the last bastion of military discipline in a valley where civilization had been buried 15 feet deep. The rescue of the Miller family was just the beginning. The hidden bedroom was now the neural center for a new, grittier kind of war, a logistical battle against starvation, an exposure that spanned the entire Bitterroot Valley. William Wynne, with Miller at his side, was transforming the bunker from a retreat into a relief hub. The air was thick with the scent of dried wood, coffee, and the metallic tang of chemical heat packs being vacuum sealed. William stood over the map table, his rugged, callous hands, the same one seen in image_2.png and image_4.png, pointing intensely at a new marked point of a distress signal in a distant canyon. He was no longer just a pathfinder. He was a commander. Miller, now as capable logistics officer, wearing an insulated thermal jacket, as seen in image_4.png, nodded as he noted the coordinates and supply requirements on his clipboard. Smoky, the powerful German shepherd with his black and tan coat, as seen in image_2.png and image_4.png, sat on a rubber mat nearby, his amber eyes watching the map, the tactical red beacon on his harness blinking. Every shelf was packed with prepared Wynne standard relief kits, vacuum-sealed mylar bags of dehydrated food, and bundles of thermal blankets, identical to those in image_2.png. They were ready. The first wave of missions was defined. As William adjusted the work light, casting a warm pool of light on the map, he realized that their madness was now the valley's only path to a sustainable resurrection. The atmospheric bomb finally broke, but it didn't bring peace. It brought a treacherous thaw. The Bitterroot mountainside, once a solid block of ice, was turning into an unstable slurry of gray slush and mud, as the temperature stabilized at an erratic 3 degrees Celsius. The entire logical foundation of the valley began to shift. William Wynne and Smoky stood on a precarious, newly exposed rocky outcrop, looking through long-range binoculars at the changes below. Modern mansions, their structures weakened by the freeze, were cracking like eggshells as the saturated ground shifted beneath them. But William's gaze was fixed on a more sinister development. Looters, groups of armed men, local scavengers who knew the mountain, were emerging from their holes. They weren't looking for survivors. They were targeting the high-end solar panels, generators, and precious heating fuel that the now withdrawn Chinook had dropped for the main relief camp. They were cutting the lifeblood of Bitterroot's sustainable recovery. William donned his tactical chest rig, checked the chamber of his long-range rifle, and looked at Smoky, who was vibrating with silent, aggressive fury. The storm is over, boy. Now comes the war of resources. Until the ground stabilized and the main roads cleared, William Wynne and his K9 were the only law left in the frost. The scavengers were not desperate survivors. They were predators of opportunity, armed with bolt cutters and light firearms. They were dismantling a critical solar array near the valley's primary medical cache. They were stripping the future of Bitterroot for parts. William Wynne didn't use a megaphone or a warning shot. He used the terrain. Under the cover of the gray, heavy mist that rose from the melting snow, he and Smoky moved with the terrifying efficiency of a special operations unit. William reached a vantage point, his moss-green eyes as cold as the slush beneath him. He didn't want a bloodbath. He wanted a total psychological break. He signaled Smoky. The dog slipped through the brush, a blackened shadow that appeared and disappeared in the fog. Suddenly, the looters froze. A low, vibrating growl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" one of them shouted, swinging a rifle toward the mist. Then, the beam of William's tactical light cut through the fog, pinning them like insects. Standing on a rock ledge, William looked like a judge from an older, harsher world. "The solar panels stay," he said, his voice a flat, metallic rasp. Before they could react, Smoky launched from the shadows, pinning the leader to the mud without a single bite. The message was clear. The valley wasn't a playground for thieves. It was William Wynne's territory now. The threat of man was secondary to the threat of the mountain. As the thaw accelerated, the millions of tons of snow were turning into a liquid lubricant for the valley's unstable geology. The Dead Man's Curve, the only road capable of supporting the heavy relief convoys, was beginning to slide. William Wynne, standing by the cracking asphalt, could hear the mountain groaning, a deep, subaudible vibration that Smoky felt first. The dog refused to step onto the center of the road, his K9 instincts screaming danger. William realized that if the road collapsed, the valley would be cut off for months, and the survivors in the bunker would run out of more than just food. They would run out of hope. He utilized his combat engineer background, measuring the fissures with a tactical tape. He needed to stabilize the bank with steel cables and the very lead line panels he'd hauled for his bunker bedroom. It was a race against a moving mountain. He organized a crew of the looters he'd captured, giving them a choice between redemption through labor or the cold of the peaks. As the earth shifted beneath his feet, William Wynne hammered the first anchor into granite, a lone veteran holding back the weight of the world. Stabilizing the road was only half the battle. The water, billions of gallons of it, was now the primary enemy. The Bitterroot River was no longer a picturesque stream. It was a churning, chocolate-brown monster carrying the debris of shattered mansions and uprooted pines. The main bridge, the gateway for the heavy supply convoy, was under siege. William Wynne realized that the drainage systems designed for luxury aesthetics were failing. Catastrophically, the water was backing up into the lower valley, where the relief tents were clustered. He looked at Smoky, whose paws were raw from the slush. They needed to blow a bypass through a natural granite dam 2 miles upstream, or the entire medical cache would be swept away. William opened his remaining crates of military-grade explosives, the items that had earned him the terrorist label from the local council. He wasn't a terrorist. He was a combat engineer with a problem that only a controlled detonation could solve. He strapped the charges to his frame, grabbed Smoky's tether, and headed toward the roaring sound of the river. The hidden bedroom was empty now, its contents sacrificed to the valley. But William Wynne's mission was reaching its explosive climax. The roar of the explosion was still echoing off the granite cliffs when the true weight of the event settled over Bitterroot. The controlled demolition had worked. The water level in the relief camp was dropping rapidly, saving the critical medical cache. But the blast had done more than divert a river. It had shattered the illusions of those who still clung to the pre-blizzard social order. The corporate lawyers and the remnants of the local council, having arrived with the National Guard, were furious. They didn't see the saved lives. They saw a paranoid terrorist who had just used unregistered C4 to destroy private geological property. They found William on his porch, cleaning mud from Smoky's paws, the tactical rifle from image_ for PNG leaning against a stone wall. The lead attorney, a man whose expensive suit was already stained with slush, started reciting a list of violations. William didn't look up until the man mentioned civilian arrest. Then the veteran stood. At 6'2" and built like a mountain, he made the city men seem fragile. "I didn't destroy your property," William said, his voice a low vibration that made the air feel heavy. "I corrected your negligence. If I hadn't blown that dam, your entire aesthetic valley would be under 10 feet of toxic mud, along with your people." Smoky let out a low, terrifying snarl, his amber eyes locked on the attorney's throat. William didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He handed the attorney the worn topographic map from image_2 PNG and image_4 PNG, now covered in mud and precise tactical notes. "Here's your property. Take it and leave. The rescue is over. Now comes the rebuilding." The arrest warrant was never served. As news of the dam demolition spread, the survivors, those who had spent nights praying for the water to stop rising, formed a human wall around William Wynne's hillside. The corporate interests realized that arresting the crazy veteran would ignite a riot they couldn't control. But William didn't stay to enjoy the protection. He knew that the thaw was uncovering more than just mud. It was revealing the structural rot of the valley's rapid, greedy expansion. Foundations of high-end mansions were sliding, and the main road, the only lifeline for heavy machinery, was hanging by a thread over a 1,000-foot drop. William turned his bunker into a tactical workshop. He and Miller began fabricating massive steel tension rods, using the very reinforced materials meant for the hidden bedroom. He was no longer just protecting a family. He was trying to stitch the mountain back together. "Why do you keep helping them?" Miller asked, his hands calloused and grease-stained. William didn't stop welding. "Because when the world ends, Miller, we're the only ones who know how to build it back." He looked at Smoky, whose amber eyes were fixed on the door. The veteran knew the hardest work wasn't surviving the cold. It was surviving the collapse of the world they once knew. The dead man's curve was more than a road. It was the only way the heavy-duty National Guard convoys could reach the isolated upper valley. If the shoulder collapsed, the relief effort would be set back months. William would move like a ghost in the gray morning mist, his tactical harness loaded with heavy steel anchors. He and Miller spent 16 hours straight drilling into the solid granite beneath the shifting mud. The work was brutal, a symphony of screaming rock drills and the sound of sliding earth. Every time the mountain groaned, Smoky would bark a warning, his K9 senses acting as an early warning system for the men. William was waist-deep in the cold slurry, his muscles burning as he tightened the tension cables that would hold the road in place. He wasn't doing it for the council or for the lawyers who wanted him in a cell. He was doing it for the people in the tents below who didn't even know his name. As the last anchor was torqued into place, a massive crack appeared in the asphalt just inches from William's feet. He didn't flinch. He just signaled for Miller to pull the cable taut. The mountain had tried to take the valley, but the veteran had pinned it down with steel and sheer will. The road was stable, the water was diverted, and the valley was finally breathing. But for William Wynne, the work was never truly finished. He spent the following weeks patrolling the highest reaches of the Bitterroot, looking for the last forgotten victims of the atmospheric bomb. Smoky was his most valuable tool. his K9 nose detecting sense buried under 10 feet of packed powder. They found an old trapper in a cabin that had completely vanished under a drift, kept alive only by a small air pocket and a wood-burning stove. William didn't ask for a reward or thank you. He simply cleared the vent, provided the man with Wynne's standard rations, and signaled the nearest National Guard unit. He had become a legendary figure, the hillside ghost that appeared when the cold was at its worst, and disappeared before the gratitude could set in. Back at the bunker, the hidden bedroom was now a community hub. Miller had stayed, helping William maintain the relief kits for the next winter. They were no longer mocked. They were respected as the architects of the valley's resilience. But as William looked at Smoky, he knew they would never truly be normal again. They were the sentinels of the cold, and the mountain would always be their primary commander. The storm had moved on, but it left behind a landscape of crystalline silence. As the mercury hovered at a precarious -30, the White Death began to surrender its secrets. William Wynne, equipped with long-range thermal scanners and a specialized ice-climbing rig, pushed into the shadow sector. A deep gorge of the wind had piled snow 50 feet high. Smoky moved with an uncanny, ghostly silence, his nose detecting the faint, sweet scent of carbon monoxide from buried chimneys. They weren't just looking for survivors anymore. They were looking for the stories the valley had tried to bury. In one location, they found a luxury tour bus, completely encased in a tomb of blue ice. Inside, 20 people were preserved in a state of suspended animation, huddled together in their final moments. William didn't flinch. His moss-green eyes had seen the aftermath of battlefields far worse. He used his thermal lance to cut a small ventilation chimney into the bus, hoping to find a spark of life. As he worked, Smoky let out a low, mournful howl that echoed through the gorge. It was a reminder that in this frozen world, the veteran was the only bridge between those who had been erased and the world that was slowly waking up. He was the record keeper of the Bitterroot's tragedy, a man who documented the cost of arrogance in a ledger of ice and stone. The surface was quiet, but the mountain was screaming. As the ice continued to settle and the pressure shifted, the old mining network beneath Bitterroot, the same ones William had mapped during construction of his bunker, began to collapse. The hidden bedroom vibrated with a low-frequency hum that made the teeth rattle. William Wynne sat on the floor of his sanctuary, his hand on Smoky's chest, feeling the dog's heart racing. He knew the sounds of structural failure. The weight of the centennial snow was crushing the hollow earth below. Suddenly, a massive tremor rocked the bunker. A sinkhole had opened 300 yards away, threatening to swallow the main relief supply route. William realized that his work with the steel anchors in Part 24 was just a temporary bandage. He needed to enter the mines and trigger a controlled collapse to stabilize the road above. It was a descent into a labyrinth of rotting timber and freezing water. Miller tried to stop him, but William only handed him a radio. "If the mountain stops shaking, I'm fine. If it stops completely, tell the convoy to find a new way in." He checked his oxygen tank, whistled for Smoky, and entered the darkness of the earth. With the mine stabilized and the road secured, the valley began to look toward the future. But for William Wynne, the future meant a permanent change in status. He was no longer a citizen. He was a sovereign of the ridge. The National Guard, before their final withdrawal, officially designated the bunker as Bitterroot Sector Command. William was given a commission he never asked for, tasked with overseeing the security of the rebuilding process. He found himself in the middle of a bureaucratic storm as intense as the atmospheric bomb. The luxury developers were suing for illegal seizure of resources, while the survivors were demanding that William be named the permanent governor. William sat on his porch, Smoky at his feet, watching the corporate SUVs return like vultures. He didn't want the power, and he certainly didn't want the fame. He looked at the lead-lined walls of his hidden bedroom and realized that the very things people once mocked were now the only things they wanted to control. He had become the anchor of a world that was still trying to find its footing, a soldier who had won the war against the cold only to find himself in the trenches of human politics. He tightened the laces on his boots and looked at Smoky. The ice was easier, boy. Spring didn't arrive with flowers and Bitterroot. It arrived with the stench of revealed failure. As the last of the 10-foot drifts turned into a black, muddy sludge, the true cost of the valley's arrogance was laid bare. William Wynne spent his days on recovery patrol, a grim mission to retrieve what the ice had claimed. He moved through the ruins of the glass mansions, places where the smart technology had become a frozen tomb. In the wreckage of Miller's neighbor's estate, a man who had once threatened to sue William for the noise of his drill, William found only silence. The steel and glass had buckled like wet cardboard. Smoky walked with a heavy, respectful gait, his nose identifying the locations where ground had swallowed the unprepared. William didn't feel a sense of, "I told you so." He felt a deep, weary sadness for a world that thought it could buy its way out of nature's laws. He began to organize the great cleanup, a task more grueling than the rescue. He taught the remaining survivors how to salvage timber, how to burn the debris safely, and how to treat the saturated earth. The hidden bedroom was now the central archive for the valley's lost history, its walls covered in photos and items recovered from the slush. William was no longer a madman or a hero. He was the memory of Bitterroot, the one who saw the ash before the fire even started. A full year has passed since the atmospheric bomb turned Bitterroot into a frozen tomb. The valley is different now. The glass palaces are gone, replaced by low-slung, stone-reinforced homes that look more like bunkers than mansions. The mockery has been replaced by a quiet, profound respect. William Wynne still lives on the ridge. But the hidden bedroom is no longer a secret. It's the model for every home in the valley. He doesn't hold an official title anymore. He doesn't need one. He is the architect of the ridge, the man who stayed when the world turned to ice. Every summer, you can hear the sound of drills and hammers as the new Bitterroot prepares. But it's no longer the sound of madness. It's the sound of a community that has learned the hardest lesson a mountain can teach. William stands on his porch, Smoky, older now, with silver on his muzzle, sitting by his side. They watch the sunset paint the peaks in shades of fire and gold. William knows that another storm will come eventually. Nature is a patient enemy. But as he adjusts the rucksack on his shoulders and feels the solid stone beneath his boots, he knows they are ready. The veteran and his dog have earned their peace, not by avoiding the storm, but by becoming the anchor that the storm could never move.